There's always been something about the Resident Evil series that's resonated pretty deeply with me, and I imagine probably for a lot of you watching as well. Even if you haven't actually played any classic Resident Evil titles, you're likely at least familiar with the formula. You shoot zombies, you solve puzzles, you manage your very limited inventory space and ammo supply, all while navigating your panzer tank of a character through some foreboding yet beautiful environments composed of pre-rendered backgrounds. Now, when one discusses these early entries, these are all of the things that would typically be your go-to talking points, the low-hanging fruit of a Resident Evil discussion. And while these are all certainly hallmark aspects of the series, and I enjoy each of them and think that each of these components add up to something greater than the sum of their parts, there may actually be another aspect to these games that I think I might appreciate more than any of this. What I'm talking about here is the level design, or is it the map design? To be honest, I'm not really sure what the term is I'm looking for here, but what I mean are areas like the Spencer Mansion from the first game and the police station from RE2. These are areas you'll spend the bulk of your time in, navigating corridors and finding key items, backtracking around to unlock rooms and areas you first noticed hours ago, and slowly just unraveling the entire map itself as if it were its own puzzle to be solved. In a way, it almost makes for a sort of rudimentary 3D Metroidvania, and frankly, even beyond the survival horror aspects, it's a formula that I've often thought still has some room for experimentation. With this in mind, I was somewhat captivated when I first caught wind of the 1998 PlayStation release T.R.A.G from developer Sunsoft. While it clearly seemed derivative of the Resident Evil games of the time, it also seemed to make an effort to modify the classic formula and, with taking a more action-oriented approach, maybe in some ways even evolve it. More importantly, I noticed that the game seemed to take place within one maybe even larger version of a classic RE area, and maybe even had some new ideas for how the player might interact with and navigate such an area. So I took note of T.R.A.G on my phone and made it a point to give this game a try when I knew I might have some dedicated time to devote to the game. And well folks, that time is now. T.R.A.G starts you off with a fairly straightforward premise. The Togasa building, meant to be the headquarters of a major weapons and aerospace manufacturer, has been taken over by terrorists, and it's your job as members of an elite SWAT team to infiltrate the building, rescue the hostages, and defuse the situation. Now, there is one thing I need to clarify before moving on here, or should I say, something I need to come clean about before we go any further. You see, the game that I've been referring to as T.R.A.G up to this point is not actually titled T.R.A.G, or at least not the version that I decided to play. While this game was released as T.R.A.G in Japan, the title was instead changed to T.R.A.G, Tactical Rescue Assault Group for the North American release, or simply just T.R.A.G, or T.R.A.G I guess. However, you might also refer to the game as T.R.A.G, Tactical Rescue Assault Group, Mission of Mercy, which I think is its technical actual name, although strangely, despite the Mission of Mercy part being on both the box art and manual of the game, I could never actually find that part of the title anywhere within the game itself. It's possible that I just overlooked it, but the main menu definitely drops that part of the title completely, and watching the credits after completion, I couldn't find it in there either. Finally, if you really want to reach, we could call this game The Disaster Adventure, T.R.A.G, Tactical Rescue Assault Group, Mission of Mercy, which is a title I discovered while digging through the game's manual I found online. While it's debatable that this The Disaster Adventure part was ever meant to be seen as part of the title at all, it is still the only place I could find this The Disaster Adventure tag whatsoever, which is kind of interesting. Regardless, Sunsoft wisely decided to change the title back to T.R.A.G a few months later for the European PAL release, which really makes you wonder how or why they ever messed around with these horrible American titles to begin with. Now, going into this playthrough, I had fully intended to play through the PAL version because, well, that American title is fucking horrible. However, after remembering that this would require me to play the game at 50 Hz, or in other words, at 5/6 of the usual game speed, and me not knowing enough to know if my emulator of choice could negate or compensate for the speed difference, I decided to choose the path of least resistance and begrudgingly play the American release of the game. From a quick Google search, there also didn't seem to be any gameplay differences between the two versions, which solidified my decision to stick to the North American version. Anyway, despite all this, I'll still be referring to the game as T.R.A.G, both because it just sounds better and because the American T.R.A.G title is really just a travesty. I also just want to note here that this PAL box art absolutely whips ass, and the North American one, Well, I'll let you draw your own conclusions. As one last side note, I did find this box art in an archived PlayStation magazine review of the game, which I have to assume is some sort of early rendition or work in progress that was changed before the game actually shipped. That's just my own speculation, however. I wasn't able to find this box art anywhere else at all. The yellow behind the main title text is still a bit ugly here, but I would easily take this over what we actually ended up getting. So, with that out of the way, let's continue. T.R.A.G pretty closely follows most of your typical late 90s survival horror gameplay beats. You'll spend most of the game navigating through the maze-like Togusa building, taking down enemies along with the occasional boss battle, solving puzzles, finding key items, unlocking doors and shortcuts, and naturally, you'll be doing all of this with fixed camera angles and tank controls. Good old tank controls. However, as I alluded to earlier, this game abandons pretty much all of the horror elements you'd expect from the genre and instead goes for a more direct and action-oriented approach. This change has a definite impact on the overall tone and presentation of the game, but more importantly, this is reflected in the characters you play as and their combat options. You'll start your mission with access to 2 different playable characters. First, you have your male lead, Alex, who is kind of like if you took Star Gladiator's Hayato and replaced his sword with a handgun, and I don't mean that as a dig here, I actually think he looks pretty sick. Then you have Michelle, who has no ranged weapons, but does have a pretty badass combat knife. Her moveset consists entirely of melee attacks utilizing kicks, stabs, and slashes, while Alex naturally focuses on his ranged attacks, with the option for some melee strikes if things do start to get a bit hairy. Now, I say that you start your mission with these 2 because throughout the course of the game, you're going to find a few more characters to join your crew. There's Rachel, the cyborg replicant daughter of one of the professors in this building, which, as a sidebar, I'm not going to get too deep into the plot here, but you can probably already tell that it gets a bit silly. Most of her attacks utilize her tonfas, I think they're called tonfas, kicks, and her ass. Finally, we have Burns Byford, a detective who fills the role as the team's powerhouse type character. Now, I use his full name here because the game never seems quite certain if it wants to refer to him as Burns or as Byford. The menu screens use Burns, but otherwise the game seems to ping-pong between using his first and last names.
An order-made Burns bomb with anchovies and extra cheese. I think you'll find this'll blast through that baby like a knife through butter.
As weird as that is, it's made particularly strange considering there are other characters like Michelle who also have known last names, and yet hers, for example, is never once mentioned over the course of the game. At least from what I can recall. Regardless, Burns is a bit slower and shorter range than the rest of the team, fighting with his hands and fists, which at least in theory should be compensated by a higher damage output. Now, from hearing me describe these characters at even a high level, you're probably already starting to see the differences gameplay-wise between this and the series that this game draws inspiration from. I mean, outside of a painfully slow knife attack, I don't ever remember Jill Valentine busting out tonfas or opting for hand-to-hand combat with the undead. Or, at least not until some much later entries in the series. Anyway, T.R.A.G expands your character movesets beyond just the simple, what I'll call the shoot-the-gun attack that you have in most Resident Evil games, although we do still have some of that here as well. For most characters, you'll have your basic multi-hit combo you can perform by spamming the attack button, which is mapped to square. You'll have some slower and more powerful moves that will reliably knock down most enemies that you can use by holding either up or down before pressing the attack button, many of which can be thrown in during an attack string to end your combo early and ensure that you get a nice knockdown. You'll have additional attacks that can be performed by pressing either up and then down, or down and then up before attacking. And finally, every character has a special move that can be done by pressing X and square together. Now, when I say special move, what you probably just heard was unique move, which is technically true, but functionally not really. I mean, they all sort of just do the same thing. They're mostly used as a sort of get-off-me tool, and it doesn't really do much damage, but it does hit everything around you and tends to have a pretty active hitbox. This does come at the cost of a small amount of health though, with Decision that's a bit beat-em-up-esque, which I can appreciate. All of this is to say that you have a number of options for attacking, and while some moves might feel redundant or even just superseded by other options, it's definitely in your best interest to explore these movesets and feel out which attacks are best depending on the situation. Now, there are some exceptions in how these movesets play out for the different characters, some of which are a little strange. Rachel and Michelle can both run notably faster than the male protagonists, and they can also briefly guard from attacks by holding the X button, an option that actually could be quite useful, especially during certain boss battles. Hold too long, however, and they enter a long helpless state where they try to catch their breath and are wide open to any attacks. Alex, on the other hand, has a gun, and while he still has some melee attack strings like the others, his default attack is to just shoot the gun at people. He can also, after a short startup, do a burst fire attack, which is more powerful and can definitely be pretty useful. Alex is also able to swap ammo types, which interestingly has its own dedicated button mapping on the L1 button. This button only serves a purpose while playing as Alex, and from what I could tell, didn't have any sort of function at all for the rest of the cast. It's also a little strange that the only real difference that I could tell between his two ammo types is that one of them is weak and one isn't. You'll also need to be locking onto your opponents before shooting if you want to have any hope of actually hitting them, as I don't think I was ever able to land a shot otherwise. This, again, is a mechanic basically exclusive to Alex, and again takes up an entire button slot on R1. However, while the other characters can't lock on and don't even really have a need to, they can still press the R1 button to have them face a nearby opponent, which is at least something, I guess. Outside of your combat actions, you have your typical and a few not quite so typical options. There's a button to instantly use one of your healing items, a button to swap between those healing items, a run button, an interact button, a map button, a menu button, and as the odd man out here, you have a hide the HUD button, which was an interesting choice that honestly I respect, despite it usually causing me more problems than actually being useful. Now, something I've failed to mention up to this point is how you actually wrangle all of these characters that the game throws at you. You see, in Resident Evil, you typically select which character you're going to be playing as before you even start the game, or at least you will in the first two, and outside of a few small segments where you take control of a separate side character, you're pretty much playing as that character for the entire playthrough. In contrast, T.R.A.G allows you to swap between any of your characters via your menu at pretty much any time, with some exception. This idea is expanded further by having portions of the game where your team is divided and your different squads will need to work through different parts of the Togusa building before eventually meeting back up again. You're even able to swap between these squads freely for if you ever feel stuck with one squad or just need a break from one team's part and want to try to make some progress with the other. Now this I actually thought was a really cool system, and I was impressed with how seamlessly they pulled this off. Of all the ways that T.R.A.G attempted to evolve and remix the Resident Evil formula, this was easily the aspect that I felt had the most potential and that I really wish they had double or even triple down on. It's mostly just one large portion of the game that has you bouncing between parties, but I really wouldn't have minded having more sections like this. I also think there's a lot that can be done with this kind of system that this game just kind of didn't go for. I mean, imagine finding key items on Team A's side of the map that are needed for Team B to progress, and there being some sort of middle ground where the teams can't quite make it to each other's side, but they can pass items back and forth to each other. I mean, they do kind of play on this idea in spirit where one side has to turn on power in the building so that the other side can make progress, but regardless, I feel like there was still plenty of meat on the bone for more of this sort of Lost Vikings-ish cooperative puzzle solving. With T.R.A.G, it's not all innovation, however. Obviously, the game takes inspiration from a certain survival horror franchise. You might even say it wears its inspiration on its sleeve. But to my taste, I might say that inspiration goes beyond just gameplay mechanics and a bit further than you might expect. But in the spirit of show, don't tell, I now present to you a completely unfair comparison that is every similarity I could find between T.R.A.G and Resident Evil 2.
imagine meeting you here.
You're one of the most wanted men in the country, Gashu. And today I'm bringing you in.
Something's wrong. Let's check it out. Over there! Shoot it! Eat this, you freak! The guns aren't stopping it! What is this thing?
Okay, some of those were obviously a reach, but I think this illustrates my point well enough. The game had no issues with borrowing some of its ideas. And you know what? For all of this pomp and circumstance, I didn't even really have an issue with it. Honestly, I just thought it was kind of funny. So up to this point, I've been doing a lot of explaining of what this game is and what you do in it, but I think what we're really interested in is how does this all come together? What is the good? What is the bad? What is it actually even like to just play this game? And finally, is it even good? To start off, let's go over some of the game's positives. As I've made abundantly clear to this point, this game is a Resident Evil derivative, and by now it's been fairly well proven that this is a formula that works. The run around this giant building to open doors and occasionally get lost formula works wonderfully in Resident Evil, and in my opinion it works great here as well. While I think this game's evolution of this part of the formula is mild at best, I do still think that the game manages to hit all those familiar notes just about right. There's not really many complaints from me there. However, there are some changes that are made to streamline the gameplay in that your inventory space is now unlimited, which inherently means that things like ammunition and healing items are no longer going to be weighing you down. Go ahead, take as many as you like. This also means that item boxes are no longer necessary. Oh, and also, no ink ribbons here. You can just save to your heart's content. Now, none of these were things that ever actually bothered me in classic Resident Evil, but I do think that when considering the direction that Hard Edge was trying to go, these all were ultimately positive changes. As for the combat, it's okay. I'm not going to say that going the action route was a complete success, but I wouldn't quite call it a flop either. I think it's fair to say that the combat is totally serviceable. There isn't a huge amount of enemy variety and not really that many lines of interesting gameplay patterns, but for what is there, it all works well enough. Between the 4 different characters and their unique movesets, I think they've given enough options here to keep the player entertained. That being said, many of the encounters do feel a bit uninspired, and there's the occasional head-scratcher of a hitbox, but none of it was enough to really put me off completely. I think it'd be really easy to say that trying to do an action game with tank controls is really just setting yourself up for failure, but the optimist in me wants to believe that there's something to that idea there, and that the execution here may have just been lacking. However, there's also a reason the optimist in me doesn't make that many appearances, so maybe that should just be taken with a grain of salt. As far as the game's music, I've got to say, this game's soundtrack kinda bangs. There is, in my opinion, some genuine heat on this soundtrack that I had never heard before, some of which you've already been listening to over the course of this video. I mean, from the moment you start the game and take control of your character, it hits you with what I feel is one of the game's best tracks. Now, despite the music being good, this isn't to say that I think all of the tracks are the most suitable or that they're even utilized in the best way. Let's take, for instance, this track we had playing earlier in the video. It's a great track, and it makes you just want to head to the roulette wheel and bet like a high roller, ready to win big or maybe lose it all. However, despite this music certifiably whipping ass, this is actually music that the game sometimes uses to denote that you're in combat, which to me seemed entirely not appropriate. I mean, I'm not really complaining about this fact, but I often didn't even pick up on the fact that the game was trying to tell me that I was facing imminent danger due to just how smooth and sultry the music felt. Otherwise, the sound design felt solid enough to me at least, or at least all the sound effects seemed appropriate enough that it was never an aspect that really crossed my mind. Characters have loud footsteps that vary depending on the surface they run across. Weapons and attacks have their own appropriate sound effects, and all of the game's menuing sounds as well you'd probably expect. There is the matter of the game's voice acting, which, as mentioned before, is generally pretty terrible, but I think it's safe to say that it's to be expected, especially considering the era this game was released and the budget that Sunsoft was likely working with. For me, there were even some parts that crossed into so bad it's good territory, particularly the main villain Miguel's absolute dog-ass attempt at an evil laugh.
With this disc, I shall become ruler of the entire world! Ah ha 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 ha!
Just wonderful. When discussing the game's visuals, they get, at least for me, a solid thumbs up, though there are some aspects that are a bit hit or miss. As mentioned before, the general aesthetic of the character designs is right up my alley, but when we start to look at the character models themselves, it becomes not so cut and dry. There seems to be a theme amongst these models where some parts are textured with appropriate detail and in a way that I personally thought looked great, while other parts seem to be completely untextured, such as many characters' hair and pants, truly raw-dogging those polygons with maybe just a bit of vertex shading. Now, this may have been a look that would work better when playing on original hardware using native resolution, but playing this in 2025 and on an emulator with even just a conservative 2x upscaling, it made for a look that, when viewed at many angles, didn't quite come together for a cohesive look. This sort of clashing aesthetic stands out further when you compare the models to the pre-rendered backgrounds. While I knew in advance not to expect the backgrounds to scale in the same way as the models due to these backgrounds being basically glorified JPEGs, I was still surprised at how much contrast there was between the low-res backgrounds and the 3D models. Toning the upscaling down to native resolution didn't really leave me satisfied either, as on a modern HD display it was just a bit too muddy for my liking, so I never really found a sweet spot in that regard. It's strange to me because, in theory, Resident Evil titles of the time should be susceptible to all of these same issues, and yet I never remembered having these issues during emulated playthroughs. To be honest, I'm not sure what to attribute this to. Did Capcom just have better texturing work with its models? Were its pre-rendered backgrounds already at a higher resolution and thus less susceptible to this sort of contrast? Are these emulators just secretly upscaling the backgrounds in Resident Evil games? Honestly, I don't know the answer, but considering that Hard Edge's budget likely wasn't great, I'm inclined to believe it's just a symptom of that good old Capcom quality. Otherwise, taking a look at the enemies and bosses of the game, they all just looked fine. It's another case of some good and some indifferent. I don't really remember any enemies looking particularly bad, though there were some I'd definitely call uninspired. Some of the bosses definitely had some interesting and memorable designs, and even some of the basic enemies stuck in my brain well after I'd finished playing. For instance, take these guys who crawl around shirtless on the ground before deciding to go bipedal and whip out some serious martial arts techniques. Now, all throughout my playthrough there was something very familiar about these enemies, but I could never quite put my finger on what exactly it was they reminded me of. It was only while editing this video that it finally occurred to me what it was that these guys reminded me of. This promotional art and title screen art for the internet classic Barkley, Shut Up and Jam Gaiden, Chapter 1 of the Hoops Barkley saga. Specifically, this guy right here, who I assume is meant to be Charles Barkley. Visually, I'd say the bigger issue for me was what felt like a lack of enemy variety. I just got a bit tired of seeing and fighting the same handful of enemies throughout the course of the game, without the game ever really providing any meaningful additions to the lineup. And despite all of this, I don't view Hard Edge as like an ugly game or anything like that, and I really didn't hold any of these points against it. I think the game looked fine for its purposes, and while I do think on the whole, many of the areas are not particularly memorable and can feel a bit uninspired, I wasn't dissatisfied with the overall presentation. In fact, I actually really liked the HUD layout where it color-coded the character name text and had a cool sort of slice of the character's face up there in the corner. I also really liked the character sprites found in the menu, even if they kind of made Burns look like an absolute psycho. I also want to make particular note of the map menu, which in some ways I think is actually presented better, or at least cooler, than in Resident Evil. While looking at the map, and if you're like me, you're going to be looking at it pretty frequently, you can see your active character's 3D model on the map itself, along with the direction that they're currently facing. They also have marked key points such as elevators and save points, and it's mostly pretty easy to tell how everything connects and what doors you haven't yet progressed through. Maybe I'm just simple, but it honestly felt somewhat inspired, even if some parts like scrolling through individual rooms is a little janky. Now, it is lacking some features from Resident Evil, namely the changing the color of the room on the map once you've fully solved that room, but from what I remember, that actually wasn't introduced until the first remake, and it's debatable design-wise if that's even preferred to begin with, so I can't really hold any of that against it. Before moving on, I do want to touch a bit on the game's puzzles. They are, once again, they're fine. Honestly, there's not much in terms of puzzles that really stands out in my mind, but the few puzzles I do remember were totally suitable and fun enough. To get into one door, you have to solve what is essentially a simplified Sudoku puzzle, which made for a fun but brief little brain teaser. Now, this was undercut about 10 minutes later when I discovered that the solution to the puzzle was actually just posted on a wall somewhere. I guess Sunsoft really didn't expect people to understand Sudoku circa 1998, which, honestly, understandable. Another puzzle that stood out to me involved 4 circular metals that needed to be arranged into a certain pattern in order to progress. Now, it's totally possible that I missed some sort of clue somewhere for figuring this one out, and equally possible that I'm actually just dumb, but I couldn't for the life of me figure out what the pattern was I was trying to solve for. I ended up brute forcing the answers since there were only so many permutations for a solution, but it obviously wasn't very satisfying, and it's something I usually try to avoid doing. The last thing I'll say regarding the puzzles for the time being is that there is one puzzle in particular that is a big exception to all of this, but believe me, we'll get into that later. Now, for a lot of these positives I've discussed so far, you've likely noticed that many have also been undercut by some amount of complaining, or at least pointing out where things maybe could have been done better. This is partly due to me just being a bit of a negative asshole, but also because I think there's a lot of ground to cover here in terms of the negatives. To start off, let's just go ahead and get out of the way that this is not a very polished game. Mistranslations, behavioral inconsistencies, voice actor changes, bizarre decisions in terms of narrative and pacing, and even for me at least, an instance where the game hard-locked completely, although I'm willing to give the benefit of the doubt and say that maybe it was some sort of emulator-only issue.
Imagine meeting you here.
You're one of the most wanted men in the country, Gashu, and today I'm bringing you in.
I've hinted at it before, but all throughout you are frequently reminded that this game probably didn't have that big of a budget. Of course, that's all just speculation on my part. And maybe this is my own personal failure as a gamer, but despite being well familiar with the Sunsoft name, it occurred to me that I don't really know that much about this company. In fact, I was struggling to even name another Sunsoft title off the top of my head, a fact that I fully expect to lead to my crucifixion in the comments. So while writing the script, I decided to do some light research and a perusing of the Wikipedia entry covering their release history. And it seems I may not have been too far off the mark. In 1995, the American branch was, quote, heavily restructured in the face of bankruptcy, with projects in development being either sold to other companies or canceled outright. A former producer from the company claimed that they had, quote, lost millions on some golf course investment in Palm Springs and it cost us all our jobs. Fucking insane. They did seem to bounce back, however, as they still exist as Sun Corporation to this day and have game releases from as recent as September of 2024. Otherwise, from what I can gather, it seems that Sunsoft really popped off during that NES and Famicom era before hitting a bit of a rough patch during the 16-bit era, from which I'm not sure that they ever really recovered. Their release history is filled to the brim with ports, re-releases, and licensed projects, which, I mean, I respect it. They've got to pay the bills somehow. There were only a few original games and IPs that stood out to me at a glance, namely Blaster Master for the NES, Eternal Eyes, a strategy RPG for the PlayStation, and Monster Seed, an unfortunately named RPG also released for the PlayStation that I actually played a bit of as a kid. Oh, and the Hebereke series, but I only know about that one thanks to the YouTube algorithm. Anyway, that's going to be about it for this brief Sunsoft history lesson, so for now, let's get back to discussing the game's general polish. There are more mistranslations and grammatical errors throughout the game than I can comfortably count. That's probably a fact that isn't fair to hold against it. I mean, Final Fantasy VII has some of the most notorious mistranslations of all time, and we still think of it as an all-time great, but I think it's worth mentioning regardless. It's just a long series of minor details, things like items being kind of poorly named and item descriptions often being a bit vague. Things like some cutscenes being skippable and others are kind of just randomly not. Or that the cutscenes drop to 15 FPS for some reason. Or like when the cutscene text says one thing and the character delivers a line that is completely different, albeit hilarious.
People who lie really get on my nerves.
These aren't things that really hinder you in any way, but they are things that you passively notice as you play that just don't look good. Now, something that will hinder you is this game's text boxes. The game's environments are filled with interactable elements, most of which will only provide you with some flavor text, which would be nice if not for the fact that the text crawl cannot be sped up or skipped through whatsoever. This is particularly maddening when you're trying to search a room and accidentally interact with the same piece of the environment that you've already looked at and now have to sit through that same text all over again. It's such a small thing that for all intents should be a solved issue, and yet it's still here, and it adds up to plenty of wasted time over the course of a playthrough. Equally bizarre is when you do find an item in the environment, like say a healing tube. There are many occurrences where you'll find multiple of these healing items in one location, but will be force-fed these items one at a time and without any indication for how many items are left. You have to manually check this spot repeatedly, sometimes between 5 to 7 times, to make sure you've exhausted it of all of its contents. It's hard to justify a reason that these couldn't have all just been delivered in one singular prompt. Another small and kind of funny little oddity is the inconsistency in the female protagonist, Michelle's, voice acting. You see, the voice actress performing her lines in the opening cinematic has got to be a solid 2 octaves higher in range than the actress reading her lines for the rest of the game.
Alex!
You the only one left?
I don't know.
I'll make them pay for what they did to our people.
Our first priority is rescuing Professor Howard, not revenge, Michelle.
Yeah, I know.
Honestly, this really wasn't a big deal for me. I more so just thought it was funny, and there's a good chance I wouldn't have noticed this at all if not for the fact that you hear this within the first 3 minutes of the game. But it stands as another great example of the general lack of QA and polish given throughout. Now, we could spend all day giving this game a death by 1,000 cuts when it comes to pointing out a lack of polish, but in the interest of keeping this already outrageously long video from ballooning even further, from here I'm going to stick to pointing out some of the more major and fundamental issues I ran into. For starters, there is one part of the game that was honestly kind of minor, but genuinely so stupid that I feel it deserves its own special recognition here, and that is the bomb puzzle you run into midway through the game. Now, the concept is solid, if a bit simple. You have to rotate a bomb in 3D space, check the bottom of the bomb for a number, which they for some reason refer to as a letter, and then find the corresponding latch that you will then unlock. Sounds simple enough, and it is. Surprisingly, the whole segment actually feels pretty good and satisfying, if not a bit easy. However, for the final step of this process, you have to interact with the inner tube itself and make one last crucial decision. Which way do you rotate it? Burns explains at this point that despite him having experience with this type of bomb defusal, that it was this part that he fucked up last time he tried it. And I can't even be mad at him because I can see why that is. The game doesn't tell you shit to help you figure out which way to turn it. There are only 2 options. It's essentially a 50-50 guess, but if you guess wrong, it is an immediate game over. And guess what? I guessed wrong. Hope you saved recently. Now, there might be a real hard edge head in the comments ready to yell at me and explain to me why I'm actually a buffoon who shouldn't be making YouTube videos and calmly explain how the game actually does show you how to figure out the solution, but until then, I'm convinced that's just fake news. And quick spoilers, just for anyone who does plan to give this game a playthrough, just turn the fucking thing left. Another aspect I'll touch on briefly here is regarding the game's story and narrative. As I've mentioned before, the plot can definitely be a little silly, but not really silly in like a goofy or fun, outlandish sort of way. It's unfortunately silly in that it's just not very good. I think when playing the game, one will realize pretty quickly just how unserious it all is and maybe adjust expectations accordingly, or at least that was my experience with it. The game doesn't really do a good job in explaining character backstories and motivations, which is like completely fine at face value. It really wasn't even something I actually cared about, except that the game often seems to imply that there is some backstory here between characters and, from what I could tell, rarely delivers when it comes to actually explaining. Like, when you first encounter the main villain Miguel during your playthrough, your party speaks to him as though they're already familiar with him and his antics, or as if there's some sort of history there, despite the game having never actually discussed him to this point, from what I can recall. Also, some of the villains seem to have outright supernatural powers, which, while certainly cool, did feel a bit out of place and got a pretty good laugh out of me when I first saw them. Otherwise, there are files that can be found throughout the game, like in Resident Evil, but to be honest, they didn't really fill the gaps in a satisfactory way. All in all, while I would call the plot, like, objectively bad, it pretty much fell off my radar completely, so I can't say it had much impact on my own enjoyment of the game. But your mileage may vary. One of my other biggest issues with the game is just a sort of lack of cohesion. It just doesn't feel like the individual game elements found here necessarily add up to a greater whole. Maybe this is just the price that's paid when trying to innovate or differentiate, but there were definitely mechanics that left me scratching my head for how they were ever included. In fact, in many ways, it feels like a lot of high-level decisions were made by completely different people. Or maybe some decisions were made early on in development, and then later, other decisions were made, but they were too far along with the original plan to pivot, so we ended up with a sort of mishmash of ideas. I mean, I'm completely spitballing here, but that's at least what it could feel like. It's things like the fact that Alex even has ammo to begin with. I mean, he starts the game with a massive amount of ammo for both of his ammo types, and it's likely that you're going to end the game with even more. As you kill enemies, they continually drop more ammo for you, and it's usually more than what you expended to begin with. Keeping track of ammo becomes such a trivial matter that I genuinely think they could have given you unlimited ammo and nothing would really change at all. Speaking of Alex, I think it's fair to say that for most encounters, he is easily the best choice of character. Have you ever heard of a little anecdote about bringing a knife to a gunfight? Well, it holds true here more than ever, because why even put yourself in harm's way when you can just shoot the piss out of anything that looks your way with your virtually unlimited ammo? This is compounded by the fact that his melee attacks are actually pretty fast and powerful, which means for most situations, he's just going to be your go-to. Now, there are some boss fights and other edge cases where I felt other characters excelled, such as when fighting the final boss, and when I just wanted to run around the map a bit faster, which, considering I got stuck a few times, actually came up more often than you think. Despite the game's 4 character swapping system being one of my favorite aspects of the entire game, I also see it as a bit of a miss design-wise. You see, once you've reached the point of the game that all of your characters are together and readily available, you really start to notice some redundancies in your party. For example, if I have Alex to cover my ranged battles, and if I feel most comfortable with Michelle when in melee range, then what do I even really need these other guys for? At some point, your other party members are only really there for if you get bored and are looking for some diversity, as I don't feel that they all offer enough meaningful differences gameplay-wise to even be worth using. This is a problem that I think could have been solved in conjunction with some deliberately designed enemies. For example, maybe some enemies have attack patterns that Rachel is uniquely equipped to handle, or maybe some others are best dealt with using burns. But sadly, that didn't really seem to happen here. For the most part, it felt like just using your best melee character was the right choice for all melee battles. The extra characters can serve as extra health bars, which in practice means using them in place of healing items, but even that is a pretty limited utility, as at some point you're going to need to heal your characters regardless. You can't even try to expend other characters as a sort of extra life, as it's a game over when any of your characters die. So really, in terms of gameplay, there just isn't a lot of utility provided from actually using each of your characters. Now, I do think on some level, Sunsoft recognized this issue and tried to give unique reasons to use each character. For instance, most of the characters do have a unique ability that's needed to progress through the map. Alex can navigate dark rooms with night vision goggles, Rachel can crawl through small spaces, and Burns can move heavy objects, but none of this really solves the issue in terms of combat, despite being a cool idea. It also doesn't help that this often doesn't actually force you to use that character. Like, after crawling through a small space with Rachel, there's usually not anything stopping you from immediately swapping back to Alex, or as you might call him at this point, the head of the table. My last point, and what is probably my biggest complaint of the entire game, is an issue I've been keeping a bit close to the chest this whole time. Those of you watching the gameplay with a careful eye, or those who can read between the lines, may have already picked up on this, but my biggest issue with this game is that it kind of controls like shit. Now, many of you probably just heard me say that and are immediately saying to yourself, well, like, yeah, I mean, it's tank controls. It's just going to feel like shit. And to that I say, no, that is not what I'm talking about here. I mean, sure, like subjectively that's true, I guess, but for me, I don't really have an issue with tank controls. But what I do have an issue with is just how slippery and imprecise this whole game feels, exacerbated by a mildly insane button layout. It's a little hard to put into words without playing it yourself, but just the simple act of moving around the map can honestly be a pain in the ass at times. I don't think I can point to any one specific issue here and just say that it's the culprit, because really I think it's a combination of individual issues. Your character's turn speed is significantly faster while standing than while running, which I think might make sense in principle, but in practice it contributes to the movement feeling a bit erratic. In addition, I think the turn speed while running could have probably just used some tighter calibration. The friction when running against the walls also feels unpredictable, like I never quite slid along the walls at the velocity that I was expecting to. All across the board, hitboxes kind of feel all over the place as well, getting caught on edges I never would have thought possible, and attacks that look like an easy hit would sometimes whiff without explanation. There's also a few other abilities that, to this point, I haven't really talked about. If you double tap forward, your character will do a sort of lunge forward, except for Burns, while double tapping back will have them do a character-specific evasive maneuver. Now that last one is actually pretty useful depending on the character, and it's a welcome addition in an action game that doesn't otherwise feature any sort of quick turning. But that first one, the forward lunge, not only does it seem completely useless, as I'm not sure I ever found a meaningful use for it despite trying, but it's also just fucking annoying. There were many times I accidentally inputted this worthless move while trying to precisely navigate the environment, and even worse, a few times I accidentally input it in the middle of battle. You can say that this is just a skill issue, and honestly you might be right, but it doesn't change my stance that I just feel like this shouldn't have been in the game to begin with. And then there's the button layout. So first of all, this game does not offer any button remapping options to my knowledge, which isn't that big of an issue, as that wasn't so much of a required feature during this era, and I also don't even know how much it would help here anyway. But, if you will for just a second, close your eyes and follow me on a journey where a DualShock controller is within your hands and you are primed and ready to play some hard edge. For starters, you press the start button. What happens? Does the menu appear? Or maybe a generic pause logo takes center screen as the game is actually just paused for a moment. If you guessed either of these things, well, you're dead wrong, because that's actually the map button. If you want your menu, that's actually map to select, aka the button that probably should be the map button. Now, exiting your map menu, you now want to run forward. What button do you hold to run? If you said circle, once again, you are incorrect, as the button you are actually looking for is X. Now, playing again. You decide you're tired of all of this silly bullshit and decide you just want to interact with the save point so that you can turn this game off for a bit and maybe take an ibuprofen. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, it's the circle button. But to actually progress through the menus, that's not circle, it's actually back to the X button. Hopefully you didn't forget that during the long wait for the text to load so that you could continue this prompt to begin with. Now, you exit the menu using the triangle button, which is sensible enough. But, being the little hyperactive gamer you are, you spam that button well after you actually exited the menu. Whoops, looks like you just used a healing item. Sorry about that, champ, at least you found like 6 of them on that random bookshelf earlier. Now, moving on to the next room, you encounter some enemies. Naturally, you're playing as Alex, our tribal chief, and need to pop a cap in some fools. However, all of your attacks are missing because you forgot to lock on. That's the R1 button, which is, again, sensible enough, but just make sure you don't forget this part after you've been playing some other characters for a bit. But what's this? It looks like you're not actually locked on to the most appropriate and fastest approaching enemy. You're going to need to fuck around with that R1 button a bit and pray to whoever you believe in that it decides to give you the right lock-on target, because otherwise you are shit out of luck, my friend. If all else fails, just use that special move with square and X when they get close and you'll probably be alright. You'll probably also want to use your good ammo here, as there's not much of a reason to use the not good ammo, so make sure you press L1 to swap over to it. Since it's not a very intuitive mapping, you're going to want to make a special note of that one, because if you forget and accidentally press L2, well, you just stepped into a world of fuck, because that just hit your HUD and you probably didn't want to do that. Otherwise, to swap between your healing items, that's going to be R2 and your standard attack will be on square, and honestly, no complaints there. Now, if your eyes are still closed, you're free to open them now, but I hope this gives an idea of what it feels like to play Hard Edge. It isn't horrible, but probably not as bad as I've made it out to be, but so many things just feel off and wrong, and they all seem to compound on each other in really stupid ways. Like, I feel like I'm generally pretty good at quickly learning and adapting to new games, but I'll be honest in saying that even by the end of this game, I don't know that these controls ever felt quite right to me. 5 hours into the game, I still found myself hitting start to pull up the menu and instead getting to once again see my goofy-ass character pacing along the game's map. Now, despite everything that I just said, I still found myself giving this game the benefit of the doubt. I mean, it is tank controls. It's like everyone says, it just feels bad, right? I mean, I don't personally remember Resident Evil feeling this bad, and I've played plenty of the series in my time, but now that I'm sitting here thinking about this, it's probably been at least 5 years since my last run of any classic Resident Evil title. Am I crazy here? I mean, I've spent the past like 40 minutes yapping about how Resident Evil shits all over this game, and yet, am I misremembering what it feels like to even play a Resident Evil game? Well, folks, there's only one way to find out. Okay, no, I'm kidding. We're not doing this. This video is long enough already, and we don't have the time. It's Resident Evil 2. We all know what the fuck is up. It's great, and it's an all-time classic. However, I wasn't kidding about giving it a quick playthrough, at least a quick Claire A scenario run. Sorry to any Mr. X fans out there. And well, the results really weren't that surprising. The game is sick, and it just looks and feels better in almost every measurable way. The movement is tight and predictable, the visuals all coalesce perfectly, even with mild upscaling applied, and it's just a good game, man. I ran through it while in a Discord call with some friends, and it was just as good as ever, taking a little over 3 hours to finish. So, having completed both Hard Edge and Resident Evil 2, and now feeling satisfied and having performed my due diligence in analyzing this video game, there's still one big question that remains. Is the game, is it good? And really, that's not an easy question to answer. Despite all my theatrics, I really don't think it'd be fair to call Hard Edge a bad game. I mean, I'd be lying if I said that most of the things in this game didn't feel a bit less than, but that didn't stop me from ultimately enjoying my time with the game. It's certainly a mixed bag, and I definitely wouldn't recommend it to just anybody, but I do think there's a genre of player out there that could give this game a go and really enjoy their time with it. So let's break it down. Do you enjoy old school Resident Evil and feel you just haven't gotten your fill of the formula? Then I'd definitely say it's worth giving Hard Edge a shot and see how you like it. An initial playthrough should take maybe 5 or 6 hours, though like Resident Evil itself, you could likely cut that time in half if you knew what you were doing. Do you have a fondness for late 90s PlayStation gaming? Maybe just boot it up and see how you like it, but don't expect anything too mind-blowing. Did this video otherwise catch your attention and get you interested in the game? Then feel free to give it a shot, but be warned, at this point, you may have seen the bulk of what the game has to offer. And what if you thought the game looked cool, but damn it, who has the time to play a video game these days? Well, in that case, I've got you covered, because that's where the secret third option comes in. Watch me play through the game in its entirety, lightly edited, but still including all of the game overs and aimless wandering, so that you can experience the game vicariously through me instead. Don't worry, it still counts. If you're interested in that, then you can find that video on this channel as well. Either way, if you've somehow made it this far, I want to sincerely thank you for having watched this video. Hell, even if you haven't made it this far, I want to thank you. I'm pretty new to all this and don't really know what to expect here, so every view and comment this video receives is really and genuinely appreciated. I'm planning on putting out a few more videos in this same style, although maybe not quite as long as this one, so hopefully we'll see you there too. Anyway, hit all those usual buttons, and otherwise I will see you in the next video. Peace.